which is the Benifei report on refugees, social integration in the single market. So I'd like to hand over to Mr. Benifei, the rapporteur.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to present my report to you on social inclusion and integration into the labor market for refugees. It's a great honor to present it here in plenary. It's a huge challenge and we have to find a solution. When I took on this report, I was very apprehensive because I was fully aware of how complex this matter is. That is why I would like to start my presentation by thanking my shadow rapporteurs very warmly for their contribution to the text. I would like to thank them for working hand in hand with me throughout the whole procedure here in the European Parliament. Only the ENF tried to throw a spanner in the works. That's Mrs. Le Pen and Mr. Salvini's group. They're not even here today when talking about such a key issues such as refugees, which they like to talk about on television. The European Parliament has to put forward an analysis on the situation, policy and measures taken to help with social inclusion and integration in the case of refugees. There are some main planks and starting points. First of all humanitarian refugees are forced to leave their country and therefore they are a particularly vulnerable group. Given the state of health of the European economy that is trying to extricate itself out of a long crisis with high levels of unemployment, the situation is very difficult. I also talked about what kind of assistance can be given to refugees, but that all of this has been tainted by myths, populism, and in the worst of cases, even racism. I also listed, I would like to list some of the key points in the report. It is absolutely necessary to give refugees access to the labor market for reasons of dignity and self-esteem. Of course, there's the whole issue of public costs as well, and it is in our interest because it makes the refugees independent, financially independent. We also have to come up with social inclusion measures as soon as possible so that the policies can be effective. There's also the issue of labor market conditions in the host countries. I believe that they play a determining role when it comes to inclusion and integration. The Member States and the European Commission have to continue providing funding and making this a priority in order to help create jobs and create economic growth. Social inclusion and integration measures for migrants and refugees need as much money as they can. We mustn't take the money away from funds for groups that are already deprived. This would be a huge error and it would create competition among the poor and would lead to more social injustice. That is why we have to make sure that the ESF gets 25% of the overall cohesion budget. We have to amend the directive on reception conditions, making sure that those who are given international protection can get a job or can access the labor market within 6 months of approval of the application. We have to increase public funds available and provide more financial resources to the local and regional authorities, as well as civil societies organizations and volunteering organizations. They are in the front line when it comes to welcoming refugees in our society, and they have to be involved in policy making. I hope that the report that the Employment Affairs Committee voted on will be a useful tool in this respect, because this issue is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity that our society should grasp and that the EU should grasp. I'll be very happy to listen to your comments and answer any questions. Thank you.
For the Culture and Education Committee, Ms. Ward.
Right. Okay, thank you, Chair. I'd also like to thank my colleague Brando BENIFEI for his work as rapporteur and Silvia Costa for coordinating the opinion of the Cult Committee. Education is the key to both economic and social inclusion of refugees and asylum seekers, in particular young people. And that's why the Culture Committee has put forward the notion of education corridors and calls for further supporting the cooperation between EU universities and universities in places of conflict, to ensure that children and young people who have to flee their country can pursue their education, which is a human right. It is not only important for welcoming countries who will benefit from the economic contribution of educated newcomers, but it's a moral and human duty for European societies to guarantee that these young people have the opportunity of a brighter future. I also want to highlight the role of informal learning, including lifelong learning, sport, volunteering, culture and the arts, which, by providing spaces for intercultural dialogue and exchange, not only facilitate the social inclusion of refugees into their new communities, but also address stereotypes, prejudices and discrimination by the majority. Too often, dominant narrative says that somebody else is always to blame for the world's problems. This results in a culture of fear. But when people come together and talk honestly and share in each other's culture, they learn that we're all human beings with common aspirations and concerns. Thank you.
Ora la parola alla Commissione.
Commissioner Thyssen.
Thank you, President. Dear Members of Parliament, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Benifei, and of course also the, let me call it, associate rapporteur of the Cult Committee, Madame Costa, for their report, which provides valuable recommendations for us and Member States. Many of these recommendations have already been taken into account, which proves that we share the same concerns and that we are on a right track. 2 weeks ago, we organised a thematic event on measures to support the integration of asylum seekers and refugees in Brussels. You were there also present, Mr. Rapporteur, and I think we all shared the view that not only we have a moral duty as a society to welcome these people who are fleeing wars or other situations of extreme pressure in their countries, also from an economic point of view, the cost of non-integration would be much higher than the investments in integration. It is clear that the ongoing refugee crisis has put the European Union and its member states to a test. Beyond meeting the immediate needs of refugees, it is essential to promote their integration in the host society and in the labour market. We know that the integration challenge comes at a point that Europe is recovering from a prolonged crisis, with the impact still felt on big parts of our societies. Mainstreaming the integration of refugees should be an integral part of our efforts for better coordinated and more inclusive social, education, labour market and health policies in the European Union. It is about offering meaningful opportunities for all to participate in society and in the economy, so it is not about taking from Peter to pay to Paul. While integration is of course a Member State's competence, the European Union has an important role to play in providing support to them. We promote the exchange of good practices to ensure early integration and facilitate the better use of available European funding. I am pleased to note that many of the points stressed in your report were also reflected in the action plan for the integration of third country nationals, adopted on the 7th of June, as you know. I am referring in particular to the notion of a multidimensional and two-way approach to integration. I also welcome the focus on early and effective access to the labour market, vocational and language training, education, basic services as for instance healthcare and housing. Early integration into vocational training can provide third country nationals with a basis for successful integration into the labour market and progression towards a higher level of qualification. Honourable Members of Parliament, refugees come with a diversity of skills and they can contribute to our economies. I welcome that your report highlights the need for better assessment of formal and informal skills and recognition of third country qualifications. This step is important to releasing and employing the potential of third country nationals. As I presented to you on the 7th of June, the Commission has put forward a new skills agenda for Europe, and this skills agenda has specific provisions to address this challenge. In particular, in the context of the skills agenda, we have proposed the following specific elements: improving transparency of third country qualifications through the revision of the European qualifications framework, supporting frontline services in identifying and documenting skills and qualifications of refugees through the launch of the skills profile tool for third country nationals, promoting the upskilling of low-skilled third country nationals to the proposal for a Council recommendation establishing a skills guarantee, and ensuring that better information about qualification recognition practices in different countries is collected through the new Europass framework. Furthermore, let me mention the Blue Card Directive, which aims to attract highly skilled third country nationals to the European Union to work. In the revision of the directive, the Commission has proposed to open it also to highly skilled beneficiaries of international protection. I know that the Parliament had been advocating in favour of such a measure. Dear Members of Parliament, as I mentioned earlier, the Commission has a key role to play in facilitating the use of available EU funding. I welcome that your report acknowledges that the Commission's efforts to simplify and increase synergies among the available funding instruments. Furthermore, I take note of the fact that your report is advocating for introducing a minimum share of 25% of the cohesion policy budget for the European Social Fund in the revision of the MFF, in order to ensure adequate resources for labour market integration. This, however, cannot be taken on board at this stage, as it will necessitate a revision of the cohesion policy legislative package. As regards the ESF and FEAD resources, we consider that relevant programmes are broad enough to accommodate the needs of refugees, but we stand ready to swiftly process reprogramming requests should these be made by the Member States. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome that your report also stresses the importance of better analysis and enhanced knowledge in the realm of integration. For this reason, over the past months, the Commission has reached out to its networks of experts and stakeholders, Eurostat and partner organisations. We exchanged views on collecting of data on the outcomes of third country nationals and how to map the implementation of the relevant policies across Member States. We also organised peer learning events and activities involving different stakeholders, such as the ESF managing authorities, the public employment schemes network and civil society, to see various perspectives. In its action plan, the Commission announced that it will reinforce exchange of practices, notably through a revamped European integration network. The European website on integration is already a Europe-wide platform for networking on integration, supporting exchange about policies and practices, but to facilitate mutual learning in tackling the challenges of the refugee crisis, we have also developed an online database of promising practices, especially for the integration of asylum seekers and refugees. To conclude, investing in integration policies today will contribute to a more prosperous, cohesive and inclusive society in Europe in the long run, and I am pleased to see this view is reflected in your report as well as in the recent Commission's initiative. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, honourable members, and thank you, Mr. Rapporteur.
Grazie.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'd like now to give the floor to speakers for political groups. First of all, Mr. Mann on behalf of the EPP.
Grazie, Presidente. Yes, thank you very much, President. Well, it was a pretty hard job to get 377 amendments down to 36 compromises. So on behalf of the EPP, I'd like to thank Brando BENIFEI for the constructive cooperation. I think the hearing was very valuable, and I think that the months of intensive negotiations were also very much worthwhile. We hope that asylum seekers and refugees are not going to become the long-term unemployed of the future. Let's hope that we can ensure that we can prevent social exclusion. To do that, we need to be able to make use of skills and competencies built up in the home country. We need to recognize that properly, and there's already a very good experience of that in small and medium-sized companies. Language competencies acquired in the home country also have to be built upon, and we need to work to ensure that we can avoid ghettoization and parallel societies. Now, whether this is voluntary or obligatory, that should be left up to the member state concerned. But we want to reject any kind of special status for refugees. Minimum wages, for example, should also apply to refugees and asylum seekers. We also have an AMIF fund, which is targeted at helping migrants to integrate. The European Social Fund is another example. Well, it wasn't possible to expand the social fund in the MFF negotiations, but I think that that should be improved so that we can send out a clear signal in the near future. What about access to the employment market? In some countries they have to wait for 3 months, in others 6 months, in others 9 months. That's a highly delicate subject. So we can't have a single harmonized solution, unfortunately. So respect for the subsidiarity principle is very important. And I must say that it's very important indeed that we adopt this important report with a very broad majority. I hope the EPP and other groups will follow my recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Ms. Steinruck for the Socialist and Democratic Group. People who flee war, torture and persecution must be given the opportunity to integrate labour markets so as to rebuild their lives. Member states have to do their homework. If they don't do their duty in facilitating labour and social inclusion, they will entail enormous costs for society. People have to be able to enter the labour market so as to ensure that they're economically independent. For the S&D group, it's essential that we avoid creating parallel job markets with cheap jobs for immigrants who will then compete with low-paid workers, the unemployed. That will create a sense of dissatisfaction which will feed into right-wing populists. This is why it's so important that we create a fair situation. It's also important that local authorities and people working locally for integration be given the support they need. I would like to thank Brando BENIFEI for an excellent report which sets out a long list of things which member states have to roll up the sleeves and start doing. Thank you. For the European Conservative Reformist Group, Ms. Stevens.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Collega's.
Ladies and gentlemen, the current asylum crisis means we need a vision for integrating refugees. I think that this report isn't balanced in its approach. I'd like to stress that integration must involve rights and responsibilities. Governments have to invest in the integration of refugees, and in exchange we need a commitment on the part of the refugees. Only if both parties accept their responsibility can we succeed in this challenge. Secondly, I defend the idea that social rights must be extended. We have to think carefully as to how we can guarantee the sustainability of our social system. We have to avoid damaging the credibility of social protection in Europe. Thirdly, I don't believe that asylum can be a solution to an aging population in Europe. Asylum can't provide a solution to structural shortages. So I'm not in favour of any reform to the Blue Card directive combining refugees and asylum. We're talking about two different issues which have to be dealt with separately. Finally, I'd like to point out that a flexible employment market can make a contribution to the rapid integration of refugees. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Stevens.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. For the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats, Renate WEBER.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, I'd like to start by thanking the rapporteur for his work, his dedication to this topic of utmost importance, and his constructive approach during the negotiations. The text that we are discussing today is the result of hard work and compromise done by a vast majority of this House, and this attitude speaks for itself. There is no place for petty political arrangements or populist agenda when it comes to refugees and their integration into our society. Not prioritizing today would mean not only indifference but also irresponsibility for our society in the future. We should not spare any efforts to ensure a proper social, cultural, linguistic and economic integration of the refugees, and we have many reasons to do so. The first should be understanding of the phenomenon, keeping in mind that we, Europeans, are what we are today as a result of different waves of mass migration. The second one should be humanity. No one, under any circumstances, wants to live in war. No one wants to leave their homes, families and countries and undertake an exhausting and dangerous journey if they can choose otherwise. It is an act of pure despair, and we Europeans should stand by our values of humanity and tolerance. The third one is the fact that the integration of refugees is beneficial not only to them, but to our society as well. In the long run, we could compensate for demographic challenges of our continent, and through recognition of existing skills, language, educational and vocational training, we would be able to match the supply and demand of our labour market. Therefore, I hope that the report will be voted tomorrow by a large majority of this House, thus sending the right message. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Weber.
Thank you, Ms. Weber. For the Confederate Group of the European United Nordic Green Left, Ms. González Peñas.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, I'd like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Benifei, for his work, and I'd like to thank the shadow rapporteurs for their contribution to this report, which we hope will be a step forward when it comes to the social inclusion and integration into the labour market of refugees. For our group, guaranteeing access to housing, education and training, social protection, health and family reunification are irrevocable pillars that we cannot call into question, because if we were to do that, we'll be calling into question the Geneva Convention, international law and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and therefore we'd be calling into question our own principles and values. We need to increase public investment by allocating a higher budget to the ESF. It's good news that refugees can access the labour market within 6 months since the moment they apply, and that they will be paid equal wages as European citizens, and of course that there's protection for vulnerable people. We have to make sure that we don't have any pernicious dynamics so that some refugees don't get more entitlements than others because of where they come from or because of their education. We shouldn't have first and second class citizens, so we need measures against discrimination, including gender discrimination in the labour market. The shameful agreement between the EU and Turkey was a huge mistake. We have to come up with social inclusion and integration policies that are properly designed and boost the welfare state, because otherwise there will be no integration. Thank you.
Per il gruppo Verde, la parola
On behalf of the Greens, Mrs. Lambert.
Thank you, President, and I also would like to thank the rapporteur for the very, very good work that he's done on this report involving all of us. The common European asylum system is absolutely clear on issues around access to the labour market and the rights that go with it. It was a very key point when we were renegotiating the Qualifications Directive 2 or 3 years ago, and of course the possibilities there in the Receptions Directive. We have a wealth of experience in Member States dating from the Equal programme and indeed beyond that. And for those that were talking about integration being a two-way process, it's true. And one of the conclusions from the Equal programme was that integration starts on the day of arrival for asylum seekers and the day before arrival for receiving countries. It's important, as others have said, for local, regional government and other institutions to have additional resources, additional, not replacing existing training for host communities, but to take account of the special needs of those arriving. And that investment in people is crucial and certainly repays in many, many ways. Language acquisition, access to education are crucial, and we know this can be a real challenge for teenagers and adults who may have had disrupted or no access to education. But we shouldn't undo the good work in terms of the training opportunities by perpetual short-term residence permits, which provide a problem both for the individual and for employers. And we need to take that into account when looking at the asylum system.
Grazie per il gruppo Europa.
Thank you. For the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy, Ms. Ajaya.
President.
Yes, thank you very much, President. I'd like to thank my colleague Brando BENIFEI for all the work he's put in and the excellent efforts he's made to cooperate with the shadows. I realise that it's not been a very easy subject. Europe met in Valletta with the African countries and was supposed to be creating a holistic approach, but at the same time it's a Europe that's creating walls, creating barbed wire, preventing proper integration and burden sharing. So on behalf of the Five-Star Movement, I think I could say that we could support the key points in this report. We've called for an analysis of the causes of immigration to try and understand where people are leaving, why they're leaving their homes, so that we can take on the problem at its roots. Then we want to see solidarity and taking responsibility. It's only by burden sharing that we can deal with the issue of immigration. We can't do without cooperation between countries. We've called for legal entry routes and for a fair distribution key for migrants. We've also called for more of a vision from politicians. They've been responding to the emergency, but they haven't been thinking about what we can do better in the future. And Mr. BENIFEI, we are from the same country, and we are on the forefront of dealing with this emergency in a very difficult context. Mr. BENIFEI knows very well how severely Italy is suffering from problems like unemployment and social division and difficulties in society. So I think that the countries that are most concerned by the first reception of migrants have to receive better support. I think a more courageous vision would have been entirely justified. So I realise this is not a defect in your report, but it's required. Now, Mr. Obermayr will be the next speaker. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Unfortunately, I can't congratulate anybody for this report since it simply disregards reality. 1 in 5 in Europe, 1 in 5 young people are unemployed. Every other young person, 1 in 2 in Greece is unemployed. Meanwhile, we see an influx of refugees, many of whom have no qualifications, streaming into Europe. I heard Mr. Čečin talking about a new economic miracle in Germany. because all these refugees are just the people that Mercedes need. Let's take a sober look at reality, ladies and gentlemen. Just 54 people have been working for German stock market quoted companies, 50 for the post office. This is a ridiculous proportion of the 1 million refugees. Who's left over? People who have to take up cheap jobs that will lead to social tension and an increasingly sense of frustration and bitterness amongst citizens who will blame the EU for all of this.
The next speaker will be Mr. BALCZÓ. Madam President, thank you very much for giving me the floor. The major challenge that the European faces right now is how it is going to manage the refugee crisis. Well, that might seem to be the case at first sight, but the real question is how can we stop this crisis? Many of these migrants have very different cultures, and is it possible for different cultures to live together harmoniously? No, multiculturalism has failed. Now it's a question of 100% integration. That's the hope, that these refugees are going to integrate in European culture and European society. Well, what do they get in return? They get social protections, they get health care, they get housing, they get a job. But where can European citizens actually get access to this? And what is all this supposed to cost? Nothing. If you don't follow the quotas, then the country has to pay 250,000 euros for in compensation. I mean, that's ridiculous. Mr. Kósa, next speaker.
Tisztelt kollégák, a jelentés...
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen. I was able to work very effectively with the rapporteur, Mr. Benifei, when we dealt with the question of the disabled. However, the report leaves me with mixed feelings. One of the fundamental problems I see here is that we are not able to give our voters real information or answers thanks to this report. There are 120 million unemployed people in the European Union. Youth unemployment has reached dramatic, indeed tragic, proportions in many member states. How can we explain to our voters that those people matter less to us, that they matter less to us than refugees? Then that the European Social Fund is to be increased by 3%. So I think we could all agree how important it is to have clear rules and a level playing field. We have to ensure that migrants and refugees have rights and obligations. First of all, we have to draw a clear distinction between refugees and economic migrants. Refugees are entitled to these benefits. We have to avoid making the mistake where we, as member states of the European Union, start telling others what to do. Many parts of this report pertain to aspects which should be dealt with by member states under subsidiarity rules.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. ULVSKOG.
Fru talman.
President, it's not an easy task to try and call for a constructive integration policy in a climate where xenophobia and fear is on the rise. So I would particularly like to thank Brando BENIFEI for this report. I think it has become a very good report that the whole Parliament should be able to give its support to. In my committee, the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, we have stressed that work is the best way to get people included in a new society. While you're an asylum seeker, I think that employment is what plays a real role in the inclusion. We need to ensure that asylum seekers shouldn't end up in social exclusion or exploitation on the black market. Mr. BENIFEI stresses that we need to use the European Social Fund to support the integration process. We need to ensure that refugees don't end up in terrible situations where exclusion is the only alternative. We need to invest in a European future, and I hope that that's something we can all agree upon. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mr. Hoc for 1 minute.
Dziękuję, pani przewodnicząca. Wielokrotnie już mówiłem.
Thank you very much, President. We have heard many times that integration without assimilation is utopia. There's also the issue of multidimensional integration into the labor market. I think that Europe should ask refugees whether they are ready, whether they are willing to honor certain commitments, and whether they are willing to accept the rules of the host country, and whether they accept labor rights and local traditions. If they do not accept these labor market traditions, then we won't have a proper labor market. There has to be assimilation, there has to be willingness on both sides.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. von Storch. You have 2 minutes.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. We're talking today about refugees and their so-called social integration or inclusion in the labour market. There's an opinion poll published in the FFA newspaper today. The newspaper spoke to the 30 biggest companies in Germany. They all have turnover at least 1.1 billion euros, and they have 1.5 million employers. All those companies together have, since June, hired 54 refugees. The Post Office 50, S&P 2, and another company 2. In other words, the vast majority of German major companies haven't hired any refugees, including Daimler. Mr. Setcher, who we've just heard about, referred to refugees, describing them as the basis for the next economic miracle. He said that's exactly the type of people we're looking for, Mercedes. However, it now emerges that he hasn't hired a single one, not even a token refugee. The fact is, what's awaiting us is not an economic miracle, but an enormous burden on our social state. We haven't allowed well-trained technicians into the country. In the best possible scenario, we've allowed highly motivated young people in who have no qualifications and won't be able to get qualifications in a highly technical market. They simply couldn't find work in their own country. We have to face up to reality. Reality is that refugees are here on a temporary basis. In other words, they don't need to be integrated even to the labour market. We have to help them as much as we can, but we can't help them all. Moreover, refugees should be coming in via normal immigration channels rather than asylum. So we do need Fortress Europe. At the same time, national law should be allowed to establish rules on migrants based on the specific needs of the labour market, and each country should be able to establish itself how many it takes in.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bizzotto has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. In Europe, there are 22 million unemployed citizens and 122 million people who are living in poverty. This is what will drop the mask of the face of the left. We don't need new migrants. Let us stop playing with words. The real refugees only account for 30% of the illegal migrants who arrive in Italy. The word refugee means that the person will go back to their country of origin once the war has come to an end. That is why talking about long-term integration and having a debate on that is useless. We all know that this open door policy for everyone will lead to the death of the peoples of Europe. You should be ashamed because you are aiding and abetting the human smugglers. You're not saving human lives. You're not saving people from poverty. You're just importing millions of new slaves. The migrant business, of course, plays into the hands of multinationals, and this, of course, will push down the wages of our own citizens. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Zarianopoulos.
Do you accept this blue card? Yes. You have the floor.
Señora Presidente. ¿Es usted consciente?
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bizzotto, are you aware of the fact that millions of Italians emigrated to Latin America seeking a better future, and this happened throughout the whole of the 20th century? We're talking about millions of Italians who migrated to the United States of America seeking their fortune. Do you realize that Italy is a founding member of the EU that has signed the Geneva Convention and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that seeking opportunities as an economic migrant is very different to the rights that one is entitled to when one is persecuted in one's own country? Yes, of course. I know. I come from Veneto, where so many people emigrated. My aunt and uncle emigrated and went abroad, but there is a high rate of unemployment. People cannot make ends meet, and elderly people don't have enough money to buy their medication. So we have to defend our own people before we defend anyone else. I would like to save the world, but we cannot. I would like to defend my citizens first.
Now,
after that answer, we'll have Mr. Zarianopoulos. 1 minute.
Η δίθεν ανησυχία της Ένωσης για εργασιακή.
EU is apparently worried about integration into the labor market, but that doesn't really mask what it really wants. It doesn't mask its barbarity. It is returning refugees and violating refugee law. It is closing borders, and it is encouraging racism and xenophobia. A lot of people are trapped in the first country of arrival, and it is using migrants to plug gaps in the labor market, using them as cheap labor, pushing down wages for everyone. It is trampling on labor rights. This report praises the fact that that refugees will become taxpayers. We have to make sure that those refugees who stay and where they choose to stay have full rights, and that there is education for refugee children, and it shouldn't be the NGOs that get the money but the state.
Do you accept a blue card from Mr. Obermeier? Do you accept? Yes. Mr. Obermeier.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, you're saying that the refugees are being oppressed, they're badly treated. Well, I don't know what country you're talking about. I don't know all of them. In my home country, Austria, refugees get between 500, 800 and 1,000 euros, depending on which region you're talking about. But I don't know what you're talking about, but I know that what you're saying is absolutely false. In my home country, refugees certainly aren't being oppressed. Thanks.
First of all, I call into question the wages of refugees in Austria. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that Austria and other countries were involved in an official decision of the EU and built walls and fences. It's not just us saying that migrants are going to be used as cheap labor. Mr. Schäuble, Mr. Moscovici and Chancellor Merkel and multinational companies have said it very openly, saying they're going to use them as cheap labor, and the report itself admits this.
Okay, well, whether you're satisfied with that answer or not, we'll continue. Mrs. Ribeiro has the floor. This is a humanitarian crisis caused by a war, and it requires rapid and effective responses from us. Europe was founded on an ideal of peace, and in these dramatic circumstances, we need to provide a dignified welcome to these people who've tried to escape from war. They need our help. Refugees are not economic migrants, and we need to raise our voice to denounce the extremist xenophobic attitudes that are saying that this is just people who are economic opportunists. These people come to our countries, they have to respect our rules and cultures, and they have to become active contributors to our societies. This integration has to be based on a combination of rights and duties, but they need to have equality with European citizens. Access to work is a major challenge for Europe to face. We need to ensure that the recently arrived migrants have proper integration in the labour market. And it has to be... Anyway, what we need is an effective, transparent mechanism for validating experiences and academic qualifications and professional experience. At this particular moment, it's key that we should not get bogged down in bureaucracy without endangering our security. So this requires the involvement and commitment of all Europeans and personal effort from all of those people we welcome. I think it's important that we should forget selfish interests of member states. If this was an economic problem, then we would, then that would be something we could solve. But this is more than that. The next speaker will be Mrs. Jongerius. 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I would also like to thank the Commissioner and above all my colleague Brando, who has written an excellent report on a very important matter. In just 2015, 1.2 million people requested asylum in Europe. Some of these people's applications were rejected, many others were allowed to stay, and we don't know how long they'll be here for. In the meantime, these people are pushed to the edges of society, and that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the refugees. They're not allowed to enter the labour market, nor is it good for society or indeed member states, since member states are thereby creating the groundwork for poor integration. We have to tackle this problem of integration via schooling, language learning, training, so as to ensure that refugees can become part of normal life, and that when they go back to their own countries they will be able to put those new skills to good use. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mrs. Trebesius. You have 1 minute.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam President. Well, Angela Merkel said in November 2015 that the German Labour Party was looking for workers, and Germany was a rich country that could receive many people. Well, today we've heard from all of the listed companies on the German stock market that only 55 refugees have actually received employment. Every migrant who's not in employment costs the German state 50,000 euros. And if we're talking about more than a million people this year, we could be talking about 3 billion euros. And I think that we have to be quite cautious here. Of course, there are going to be employers who do give jobs to refugees, but it seems that Merkel's future vision for the German labour market looks like something of a fiasco. If the German labour market doesn't manage it, then how is the Italian, Greek, Portuguese or French labour market going to integrate these people? Mrs. Merkel's rich society has got potholed roads, collapsing schools and bridges. I mean, I don't think there's no money available for all of this. The next speaker will be Mr. Fountoulis.
Another report full of ideas and obsessions arrives at the Parliament without you sorting out who are refugees and who are migrants, leaving thousands trapped in Italy and Greece by closing borders, and you're giving incentives for more and more people to come. Are you really that naive to believe that these people can integrate into European society? Can you really integrate them in the labour market when unemployment is rampant in Europe, especially in the south. Your story is wonderful, but it's full of dragons. Those who shed blood in Belgium, France, on the underground and stadiums got education, but you didn't manage to integrate them, because there is one factor that you will not recognize: the religious hatred that they have towards us because of the religion and culture, and which make them want to kill infidels. Stop intervening in third countries and allow them to live peacefully in their countries. Promote traditional families here. Let European citizens decide and not technocrats. Thank you.
Thank
you very much. The next speaker will be Mrs. Šojdrová. Oh, sorry, before the next speaker, rather. We have a blue card. Mr. Fontoulis, would you accept the blue card?
Do you realise that some of these others that you refer to actually include members of this House? A fellow MEP of mine from the northwest of England, who has had an esteemed position as the Lord Mayor of Manchester, a policeman, is a Muslim, sits in this House. And the offence that you make when you other people is absolutely despicable. So how can you exonerate yourself from being so Islamophobic?
Köszönöm, képviselő asszony. Fontoulis úr, öné a szó.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fontoulis. You have the floor.
When you say
others, I don't know who you mean. Maybe you meant Muslims. I'm not talking about all Muslims. I'm talking about those fanatics that are coming here to slaughter people. And it's obvious that you cannot control in these flows who are the people that are coming here to harm and who are the people fleeing war or are trying to bring the war to Europe.
Egy újabb kérdést tisztáztunk, most pedig...
Well, that's another issue that's been cleared up. Mrs. Šojdrová, the next speaker, 1.5 minutes.
Dear colleagues, we all know that the integration of migrants is an important task when we have 1 million people in Europe. And we also know previous bad examples of social exclusion, ghettos and radicalization. I think that this is a task for the member states, who have the same interests: prosperity, security and safety, but they have different conditions. In the European Parliament we can share our diverse experience. We can and we must support member states in their effort to solve the problem, like entry in the labour market and so on. But here in the European Parliament, I should not tell the European member states, say what they should do. We have a directive. The access can be sped up from 9 to 6 months. Yes, they can, but we shouldn't make it obligatory. Also, the limit from the European social funds has got 3% plus. And I think this is positive. And I also think that this should be led up to the European Commission. The European Commission probably will support social inclusion of migrants. But why the European Commission is the one who should decide based on different conditions in member states.
Képviselő úr következik 1 percben.
We've heard a great deal about our manifest failings when it comes to providing safe and secure access to Europe for those who are entitled to asylum. However, the greatest challenge facing us, by far, is what we need to do to integrate the more than 1 million refugees who've come so far, plus those who arrive in the future. When it comes to integrating refugees, quick and efficient access to the labour market has to spearhead our efforts. Access to the labour market without discrimination. This has to be accompanied by education, recognition of their qualifications, language teaching, help in terms of social protection and housing. At the same time, if we're to guarantee access to the labour market, we also have to fight against exploitation on the labour market, undeclared employment. We also have to allocate resources from the whole of the European Union, such as the European Social Fund, provided, of course, it doesn't undermine existing needs.
The next speaker is Madam TOMAŠIĆ.
Hvala lijepa. Europska unija ima moralnu, a kao jaki globalni akter I političku obvezu pomoći ljudima.
Thank you very much. It's important to help people fleeing danger in their backyard, but at the same time we have to do it within the scope of our possibilities. However, asking our citizens to finance in the longer term the status of hundreds of thousands of people is something quite different. So we've got the economic challenge, we've got the importance of stabilizing public finances, and at the same time taxpayers are being asked to stump up for social rights, health care, education and even employment measures for a very large number of people. Refugees are people who are fleeing war and once the war is over return home. Others are migrants who benefit from the chaos in the Middle East to improve their own financial situation. It is obvious that they aspire to a better life in Europe. We shouldn't judge them for that, but at the same time we must have respect for the rules that apply to all refugees.
Thank you. Mr. Voigt has the floor. 1 minute.
Jawohl, danke.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We talk about a social inclusion of immigrations and equal treatment of those who are unequal. When I read this report, it's hard not to see why Brexit is happening and why so many people in Germany are despairing. The Immigration and Refugees Office in Germany's boss, Mr. Frank, assumes that about 10% of refugees are qualified for the labour market. In total, refugees represent a burden on the labour market. Why is that the case? Plato talked about people forming a political commonwealth based on a common origin, common language, common culture and common historical experience together with common citizenship. And language courses won't fit the bill there to make up the gap. You can't have cohesion between uncohesive elements.
Do you accept a blue card from Mr. Mann? Yeah. Bitte.
Earlier we heard from the right-wing camp the same again, that too few refugees on the labour market. Haven't you been listening to the debate? We've pointed out that we have to see what skills these people bring with them, and we have to see to which extent we can integrate them into companies. And there's lots of best practices we can use, and there are internships and internees. And if some of these internships have worked very well, and but this requires time. You can't just rush this through. You have to bear responsibility as well to take into account the time is needed. You must understand that.
Well, thank you, of course, for that very interesting question. A timing factor does apply to Europe, does it? But what does that mean for German workers or the Greek unemployed? I think we have to worry about the unemployed workers at home before we worry about the unemployed workers abroad. And often there is a lack of equality between them, and they are unintegratable as a result. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Rollin, 1.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. What I'm hearing here makes me change what I was going to say. I come from a country and a region where there is a mining area which suffered a huge disaster, the Bois de Casier. 262 people died in the mines, and lots of Italians were buried there. And there were workers in these mines from all sorts of countries, including from the Maghreb countries. They spoke different languages, they had different religions, but they were part of the same working community, and they were a part of the human community. And I think in this sort of debate we should remember this, and I think that the report that we've received today is a major report. It's a high quality report, and it raises essential issues and puts them at the centre of our debate. We can't allow this debate to be tainted by the idea of rejecting the others, rejecting people who are different. These are basically racist ideas which we refute. So I'm pleased to see a report like this which focuses on the need for integrating migrants. The faster they're integrated and the better they're integrated in the labour market, the faster they'll be able to make a contribution to our society, and the faster they'll be able to provide added value, and the faster they'll be welcomed and received. So that you can't say there are two sorts of workers and two sorts of employees, and that you've got to turn them into equals. So I call upon others to support the very important points being made in this report, which shows that the European Union can be a human space and a humane space. Thank you.
Gericke képviselő úr következik 1 percben.
Mr. Gericke has the floor. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. We're discussing social inclusion of refugees and their integration into the labour market today, and I'd like to thank Helga Stevens for her very successful work on this report. Colleagues, when we talk about asylum, it is often the case that many untruths, half-truths, exaggerations, etc. are trumped out by all sides. And the German major groups have been cited this afternoon, but there's been criticism made as well, because people are saying we must do something for months now. Small companies help refugees, they create training places, they create jobs, and we mustn't forget that. We should stress it. Back home, there are some companies that are really pleased to be able to use former refugees to help them grow their companies. This is the famous Mittelstand, the small companies in Germany. And so what I suggest is that ESF money should be used to shoulder the cost of integration, which actually ultimately does benefit the German medium-sized companies, the Mittelstand.
Mr. Jakovčić. Mr. Gericke, do you accept it? Yes. Mr. Jakovčić.
Madam Chair, dear Mr. Gericke, I listened very carefully what you said. Unlike other colleagues from your group coming from the same country as you, you've made particular statements about the needs of SMEs in your region. However, I would like to point out a different aspect which you touched upon. I believe it is very important to support regional authorities, local municipal authorities, because they are the ones who can support integration of refugees in the labour market, but also in the education system. Do you agree with me?
Well, I agree. This is what I was saying, that the medium-sized companies on the ground that are doing so much should be supported, but where there are refugees, and if they don't get that support, then we won't be able to support the refugees either. Thank you.
And now, Mrs. Tomc has the floor for 1.5 minutes. Thank you. The refugee crisis is a crisis for today's politics. When the first waves of refugees came in, certain questions were asked. A lot of time has flown under the bridge, but we don't have the answers. How many refugees can Europe help? For how many migrants can we provide jobs in Europe? There are no simple answers. However, To flee away from those questions is not the right answer. We're a social Europe. We want to help all those who are fleeing war. But we have to remain realistic and aware that for the integration of refugees into the labour market, there is no panacea. The conditions in member states differ. Some member states need labour, others themselves have many unemployed people. If we don't distinguish between the different situations in member states, then it may be that we can't genuinely help those who are in need of help. Thank you.
Asszony, most pedig Lukačievska képviselő asszony következik 1 percben.
Mrs. Lukačievska.
Że mówimy o uchodźcach, czyli ludziach, którzy uciekają.
We are talking about refugees. They are refugees running away from war. They're refugees who are trying to save their lives and the lives of their families. What's happening in Europe? That there are more and more people rising up against migrants, rising up and protesting against refugees. Why we see this rise in tension? Everyone that comes to Europe has to respect European values and understand European culture, and unless this happens, you can't be accepted yourself. And let's not forget either that European Union also has a lot of unemployment itself among its own citizens. Of course, European citizens don't understand why they will see fewer benefits than the migrants. And of course, it's very difficult today. We're trying to promote policies which fight against the social exclusion of refugees. But unless you teach the language of the host country, you can't then really deal with this question as to why it's politicians who are not promoting the acceptance of refugees by citizens. Every policy will fail unless we have proper language teaching.
The
next and last speaker is Mr. Pretzel. Go ahead, sir.
Frau Präsidentin, meine Damen und Herren!
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union needs to do some thinking, needs to think about how to get back on track. But there's another job of work, a Sisyphus job of work to help integrate people into the labour market, these so-called refugees. There's more than 1 million of them who in the last year found their way to Germany. They were welcomed with great panache by Mr. Zecil, chairman of Daimler, who said most refugees are young, trained and highly motivated. This is exactly the kind of people we're looking for. That was pretty much the only thing he had to say on the topic, because he hasn't actually taken on anybody. And the 30 biggest German companies on the DAX index have taken on 54 refugees in total. So if we compare that, ladies and gentlemen, with the figures going back to the New Year on the Cologne square, there were 138 perpetrators from the same group, these so-called refugees. That's what reality of social inclusion and integration in Germany looks like at the moment. And Mr. Müller from Volkswagen, who ought to be grappling with quite other problems, has expressed interest in the views of the AfD, and I think it really shows how far removed these people are from reality.
Thank you. That's the end of the speakers list, and we now move on to Catch the Eye. Many have asked for the floor, and I can't give everyone the floor. One group will get one speaker. Mrs. Grappini, go ahead, please.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner. Integration and inclusion in the labour market is a problem for the EU, and I think we all recognise that this refugee crisis has provided problems. This report is important, and As a recent MEP, I realise how important it is that we have to try and manage these issues with other groups. These are very important issues, and it seems that this is such an important issue. We cannot integrate refugees as such. They are people. If we don't have a budget to create jobs, to support Europe and to ensure that there are jobs for these people. Ladies and gentlemen, there are some extremist colleagues who are applying double standards to people. I'm from a humanist party and I cannot conceive of treating suffering people like that. Therefore, I think the Member States and the Commission have to come up with some specific rules on the integration of refugees into the labour market, and that is a rule that should be enshrined in national European legislation.
Marias, in 1 minute.
Ευχαριστώ κυρία Πρόεδρε. Έχει αποδειχθεί μέχρι σήμερα ότι η επιχείρηση ένταξης προσφύγων και μεταναστών οδήγησε σε ακόμη μεγαλύτερη ανεργία, μείωση μισθών και...
It's important to try and get refugees integrated, but this has contributed to social dumping. It has really dragged wages down. In Germany, it was thought that wages could go down to better be able to get integration of refugees into the labour market, and the objective, however, was quite something else. So I think that we are simply going to have to do a calculation, not only looking at GDP, but a number of other indicators in the case of refugees, including unemployment. It's important that the constitutional framework of the host country be taken into account, and that we give up certain traditional practices. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that the phenomenon has provoked Brexit, and there will be others who follow.
Selimovic képviselő.
Mr. Selimovic is the next speaker.
Fru President.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thinking of the great number of refugees who've made their way to the EU, integration is going to be one of the biggest issues over the next 10 to 15 years. If we manage to integrate them, we will keep open to the world, and we will remain a continent with relatively little racism and xenophobia. If we fail, we will not only have problems with the rest of the world, but we'll be facing a very dark future. We have to have much more than just education. I know that what is required can be controversial, but some countries are going to have to be forced to offer basic rights, organise language courses, and open up their closed labour markets. Let me say this: we haven't got a choice. It's solidarity that needs to be expressed with those who stand to one side that can help us prevent the problems of tomorrow. So let us, for once and for all, do what we need to do and use the soft power of the EU to move countries in the right direction.
Következő hozzászólónk Šoltes képviselő úr.
Mr. Šoltes.
Smo torej pred enim najkompleksnejših izzivov v zadnjem času, soočamo se z...
Thank you. We are facing a complex challenge. This is one of the biggest movements of peoples since the Second World War, and integration into society is obviously contingent on integration into the labour market. New sources of financing have to be tapped, which will allow for a better and more active labour market policy. And the provision of what is needed to humanitarian refugees. We mustn't forget training. Training is a basic component of integration. We have to take on those trainees who've done well. Unemployment differs greatly in different member states. That also needs to be taken into account. We shall not allow refugees to become permanently unemployed. Thank you very much. Mrs. Morvai, the last speaker.
Az Európai Unió a néhány nappal ezelőtti Brexitnek.
Dear colleague, it seems that the EU hasn't learned the lessons of Brexit. It's not ready to do so. Most citizens in the European Union are of the view that this movement of peoples has to be stopped. And the tragic living conditions which result from poverty, war, conflict, these tragic conditions and living conditions have to be dealt with on the spot. We can't export these problems to Europe. Some people think that we are making racist and populist statements, and we're being branded as such. But I'm very interested to see what happens. You can wait. You can sit back and wait until one country after another leaves the European Union. You can wait until the entire construction collapses upon itself, or else you can listen to what people are saying.
Thank you. That concludes the round of speakers. Mrs. Thyssen, you have the floor.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter, beste collega's van het Europees Parlement.
Thank you very much, members of the European Parliament. The rapporteur, Mr. Benifei, has drafted a very detailed report which covers a lot of ground, and I thank him for that work. Many speakers have said that there have never been so many migrants before who have come here seeking protection in desperation, waiting at the doors of Europe and counting on our solidarity. And it is our legal and moral and ethical obligation vis-à-vis these people who have a right to protection at international level to give them that protection. And personally, I am absolutely sure that that is preferable for everybody if we do provide that protection to those people as rapidly as possible to ensure that they get rapidly integrated into our societies and into the labour market. It's not an easy job. Efforts need to be made on both sides. We live in societies where there are rights and obligations. That's the way it works. But that having been said, refugees are a group of people who are particularly vulnerable. So we need to look at their situation. They will have been through very traumatic incidents, and many of us have to recall that many of them have a lot of training and diplomas that has been acquired elsewhere, and nevertheless it's difficult to recognize all of that because they might not have the documents to prove it. So for those without education, we have to give them the possibility to undertake basic training, the so-called skills agenda, whereby they can learn our languages. So it's better to be able to integrate and to ensure that these migrants can undertake an accelerated integration program. And there is a series of different budgets available to permit the learning of language of the country that is hosting them. Obviously, there are difficulties that still exist in our labour markets and discrimination in different forms of migrants, and we have to fight the phenomena of discrimination. Under the European semester, we're looking at the possibility of seeing how migrants can best get into the labour market, and some member states have been given specific recommendations to improve what they do with regard to the integration of migrants into the labour market. Migrants may be in the second or third generation and still be finding it difficult to get a job and get into the labour market, so we need to come up with better solutions for some of those problems. Then, as some of you have quite rightly said, it's about skills, and it is primarily incumbent on member states, with the help of the European Union, to ensure that they acquire these skills. Now, we've got various action plans and programs to promote integration of people coming from third countries. We've got the skills agenda, as it's called, which helps to promote integration of these refugees into society. We've also got the blue card, which then we've got the European funds, including the European Fund for the Most Deprived, FIAD, and others, all of which must be mobilized to allow the exchange of best practice and ensure that the capacity that we have is fully exploited in all member states, and all member states can then learn from each other. Finally, there is an instrument that's part of the European semester, which is available, and additional expenditure linked to the refugee crisis can be taken into account when the budget for this is evaluated by member states, because these are considered to be extraordinary expenses and do not have to be bookkeeping under the traditional arrangements. So, Madam President, it's not an easy job. It's very difficult for those who have fled horrors, wars and other situations in their countries to become integrated into a new society, and neither is it easy for people in the host countries themselves. But one thing is sure: it is in all of our interests to ensure that we welcome as best we can these people who have come into our territory, trying to integrate them as best we can into society and the labour market. And if we succeed in doing that, we will win. It will be a win-win economically and societally, and everybody will benefit from the agreement. So let me underline what one member said this evening. The objective is not to make these migrants into long-term or very long-term unemployed people. No, that's not in our interest. So thank you very much for your suggestions, recommendations, and the expression of common values that will help us move as rapidly as possible towards better integration of the refugees into our societies.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'd like to inform all of you that those who didn't get the floor you know that you can then submit a 200-word oral statement, oral explanation, and that will then be added to the minutes for the debate. And now I'll give the floor back to the rapporteur, Mr. Benifei, who has 2 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank all our colleagues for this very in-depth debate. I'd like to thank Commissioner Thyssen for her involvement and for the very significant words that she has pronounced. On the one hand, it's clear that this is a very complex issue. There is a need to have a balanced approach. We've said that. We need to take choices along the path of integration, but this integration mustn't be to the detriment of the inhabitants of the host country. We need to work against social dumping as well, but we want to achieve authentic integration in the labour market and in society for migrants. So thanks for the work we've done together. I'd like to thank the Commission for its clear words, and also when you look at the truth there, it's clear progress being made in the action plan for citizens of the countries in the new skills agenda. There are proposals which go in the right direction, go in the direction called for in this report. So let's carry on working along this path. Let's be constructive, as this debate has been, a constructive debate in Parliament to find balanced solutions for all, for refugees, migrants, and for our citizens who are quite right to be concerned. But we need to reassure them and make it clear that the European Union wants to build solutions for integration that are acceptable to all and useful for all. As I said, the welcome of refugees is our humanitarian obligation, but we need to ensure these people can live a dignified life, and that they've gone through a lot of traumatic experiences, but we need to give them hope again, so that they, through successful integration into our societies. But I'm also happy that those who represent xenophobic and racist ideas, like Mrs. Storch and Mr. Voigt, I'm pleased that they didn't agree with my report, but that their racist comments qualify what they are. And also Mrs. BIZZOTTO, which I think, as happens with the Northern League, she made it clear that she hasn't read my report. That brings this debate to a close. and the vote will take place on this report tomorrow. And the next item on the agenda is an oral question from the Employment Committee on the issue of Youth Guarantee and the Youth Employment Initiative. I'll give the floor, first of all, to Mr. Hendel. You have 5 minutes.
Frau Kommissarin, sehr verehrte
Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, the Youth Guarantee and the Youth Employment Initiative are both essentially tools for fighting youth unemployment. We've got some work off the ground to end this misery, but they are yet to have full effect, and more is urgently necessary, I would say. Allow me to take the current occasion to refer back to an interview yesterday by the German Finance Minister, Mr. Schäuble, who lambasted the Commission. If it's unable to solve problems quickly, then national governments will need to take hold of things and work things through together without Brussels, he said. And that was then applied to the topic of youth unemployment. I'm the last person, ladies and gentlemen, to spare the Commission criticism, but on this question alone, I think surely you wouldn't expect the archetypal disciple of austerity in Europe to say that the Commission was unable to take any action. Perhaps it's not time for Brussels bashing, but getting rid of youth unemployment is first and foremost for the Member States, including those with lower levels of youth unemployment. Schäuble is now suggesting an alliance for youth training. It's not exactly a new idea. The Commission should take him by his word, nonetheless, Mrs. Thyssen. But the talk should be of an employment fund, which especially the wealthy Member States will contribute to. These are initiatives that we've already discussed in the Employment Committee, and which I personally have started up in Thüringen and in Bavaria. What is clear is that the EU level can initiate, provide financial support and coordinate implementation, but Member States will have to work on this. In April 2013, as early as then, the Member States started up a youth guarantee scheme by which all young people should be given a good quality offer of employment, continued education, apprenticeship or a traineeship within a period of 4 months of becoming unemployed or leaving formal education. And the idea was to provide support for young people under the age of 30 in regions where youth unemployment was especially high. The funding was front-loaded within the first 2 years of the MFF. The Member States were allowed considerable pre-financing, and that was increased to 30% in 2015. But things have bogged down. Youth unemployment is still unacceptably high. Something has been done, but far too little, and it's too slow. And the regional differences are striking. Statements and reports from the European Court of Auditors, the Council of Employment and Social Policy Ministers are now available. We need clear facts and figures for the way forward and for looking at the future MFF. Can the Commission report to Parliament on the latest findings of their evaluation? Is the implementation happening properly for the youth guarantee schemes? What about the quality of offers and the sustainability of results? Are the programmes and the funds being used properly? Has the increased pre-financing sped up the take-up rate? What about access to the YG